So we are joined by David Adler, who is the general coordinator for the Progressive International and also a friend and comrade of mine. David, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I can't do any better than you've just done. My name is David Adler. I'm a political economist and the general coordinator of the Progressive International, mostly based in Mexico City. Here I am in London and making my debut here on the Red Nation. So it's a pleasure to be with you, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. And there's a lot to talk about. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of the Colombian election, a presidential election that just happened, I wanted to maybe ask you just a general question about the role of the Progressive International and where do you think the Progressive International, is going in a place like Latin America, because we do have, I'm also a member of the Progressive International, but we do have quite a contingent in Latin America, and we actually have several parliamentarians, as well as now a president, as who's a member of the Progressive International. So I was wondering if you could maybe give us a little bit of a forecast on what's going on.
Sure. We were founded in May 2020 with a simple mission, which was to unite, organize, mobilize progressive forces around the world, in particular at that moment, in the face of a rising reactionary international. So the name does not refer to progressive politics as much as it refers to this kind of contrast with, especially at that moment, founded in 2020, confronting the Bolsonaros and Dutertes and Erdogans and Trumps around the world. And so came together, and in those 2 years, we've seen that Progressive International grow around the world to include movements, parties, trade unions that represent millions of people in all corners of the planet. But of course, from launch, we've really grown in places where that tradition of left internationalism is a living tradition. And I think it's not a coincidence that we've become quite strong in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere in particular, where, due to the Monroe Doctrine, due to a long history of imperialist control, expansion, and intervention by the United States, there is a tradition that unites so many of those, again, movements, parties, and trade unions across Latin America to stand up to that imperial power to the north, and try to build, whether it's institutions of regional integration, or whether it's just a common political tradition around, for example, plurinationalism that brings together a lot of these different strands of progressive, left, communist, socialist politics in Latin America. So in the last year alone, we've seen 3 members of the Progressive International win the presidency. That's Gabriel Boric in Chile, that's Xiomara Castro in Honduras, and now most recently, as of Sunday, Gustavo Petro, who sits on the council with you, Nick, of the Progressive International. So it's, I think, a very exciting moment that we'll get into, I think, in terms of the trajectory of Latin American politics, the so-called second pink tide, which contrasts in interesting, if not totally novel ways with the first pink tide that erupted in the early 2000s. But I think in general, many people in the United States in particular are looking to Latin America for inspiration, at least to understand what has been a recipe for success for many of these progressive and left forces who are coming to power, if under such intense pressures and contradictory forces that either impede or facilitate the expression of the popular power that lifted them into the presidency in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be hopeful for. I think Boric being elected in Chile was a wonderful turning point for the country in many ways, not just because of his election, but the momentum behind changing the constitution, which was set in place to basically not be changed and to implement and solidify minoritarian rule. And in many ways, it kind of solidified that kind of minoritarian rule more so than the U.S. Constitution. So we see these kind of things that seem solid, melting into air, so to speak, to use Marx's phrase. But there's a lot to be hopeful of, and I want to return to Colombia, and just to talk about the brief, if you can maybe do a long history of Colombia and why it's been such a key ally to the United States in the region, but also in the world, and bring us up to the present in the lead up to this election, and why it was so historic.
This election is historic first and foremost because Colombia has never had a progressive left government in its long history. The best way to understand Colombia in the context of the hemispheric politics is as the crown jewel of U.S. empire, as the indispensable nation in the maintenance of the Monroe Doctrine, by which the United States has taken as its historic right to control, manipulate, intervene in hemispheric affairs. And so, even in the context of that first pink tide, as I mentioned, where many of the governments across the region were electing for the first time in their history, following the fall of various dictatorships, like we saw in Brazil, for example, electing these progressive leaders, whether it was Hugo Chavez or Rafael Correa or Lula da Silva, Colombia maintained its position as the primary conservative force in the hemisphere. And that wasn't just a simple alliance of conservative powers in Colombia with the United States. That was actively intervening to either disrupt existing projects of Latin American integration. So Colombia, for example, with Alvaro Uribe and the sort of great tradition of Uribismo named on his behalf, was the kind of thorn in the side of the Latin American integration project of the early 2000s. So while they were building these institutions like UNASUR, for example, which was the kind of great project of bringing these nations together to defend their sovereignty, to build a different developmental trajectory for the nations of Latin America, Colombia demanded the veto rights to basically say, we're going to throw sand in the gears of this project, if you'll forgive the mixed metaphor, and prevent the kind of more ambitious mode of Latin American integration that was sought by many of these progressive leaders. So that was one mode by which they became an important maintainer of a kind of Monroe Doctrine to prevent vehicles for escaping or at least defending the region against U.S. domination. But much more importantly was the cooperation between military armed forces in Colombia and the United States government. And this began in 1999 with the signing of Plan Colombia, or didn't begin rather there, but it escalated massively with Bill Clinton signing the Plan Colombia that was then accelerated by George W. Bush in the early 2000s, which saw basically under the banner of the war on drugs and cracking down on cocaine exports in Colombia, the massive export of military arms and to death squads and paramilitaries in Colombia who were responsible for the vast, extensive, and sustained repression of peasant, indigenous, popular forces that we see the consequences of to this day, where we see consistent, massacres in 2022 alone, over 50 massacres of social leaders, indigenous peasant and trade union leaders who are trying to speak up and speak out against the control of their territories by these paramilitary forces. And of course, it's no coincidence that it's from Colombia that, for example, we saw the assassination recently in Haiti, that we saw the launching of the coup in Venezuela under Donald Trump, Colombia being this place that not only interferes in the multilateral experiments of the hemisphere, but very much plays a role in being the kind of handmaiden of a certain U.S. military intervention in the broader region of Latin America, South America in particular.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And, that's some would call Duque, the former or the outgoing president of Colombia, as somebody who is a narco president or has ruled with a kind of narco government. And that accusation gets thrown around both on the left and the right. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, because I think a lot of people, when they think of a place like Colombia, they do think of the drug trade, specifically its history and it being tied to, sort of narco imperialism or the US's role in kind of intervening in Latin America. But Duque has also thrown that accusation around at other kind of left forces, particularly Andres Arauz in the recent presidential elections in Ecuador. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that as well and how that's played into the kind of violence that we've seen, the political violence specifically against the left. You have, the demobilization of the FARC, the Revolutionary Forces, Armed Forces of Colombia, who were supposed to, transition into a former political party, but there's been repression, and even despite the peace accords that they signed with the Colombian government, there's been increased violence. And I think somebody like Francia Marquez, who is the vice president elect, represents a kind of a new aspiration for Colombian everyday Colombians, especially Afro-Colombians and indigenous Colombians, because she's talking about upholding certain land rights for both groups, which have been, which have been at the center of a lot of this political violence. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I think in places like the United States, we say free and fair elections. We have things like January 6th, but it's not to the level of outright political assassinations. You had Francia Marquez as well as Gustavo Petro being surrounded by bulletproof sheets that could be brought up. There were alleged sniper lasers or red dots or green dots painting their targets while Francia Marquez was giving a speech. So there's all this kind of level of political violence that we specifically, it almost becomes a caricature of Colombia, but it's deeply ingrained within its culture.
Yeah, there's a really long history of political violence in Colombia, which definitely colored this election. We're talking about a country that, all the way back to Gaitan, has had a history of assassination and political violence against left-wing leaders who dared to approach the presidency. This is not a coincidence why this country has never had a left or progressive government, because so many of the people who have dared to speak out, dared to build political forces that would contend for power at that level, were simply assassinated. We think about leaders like Pizarro, whose daughter now, Maria Jose Pizarro, is a senator in the Pacto Histórico and one of the main figures in this project. And of course, Gustavo Petro was attempted assassination in 2018, Francia Marquez in 2019, and as you mentioned, several death threats from the Black Eagles and other paramilitary groups in the course of this campaign to intimidate the candidates. And we shouldn't just focus on the candidates. We're talking about a country where in something like 12 departments, 12 regions of the country, right-wing paramilitaries led a so-called armed strike where they basically shut down huge parts of the country in an act of vast intimidation. And I think that there's a tendency to think of the democratic process as being, can I go and cast my vote? Can I go and do I have to stand in a long line? But the process of intervention in the democratic process begins so long before the day of the election. It's shaping a whole atmosphere of fear, intimidation, so that people don't feel like they have the right to express themselves democratically, whether that's in the street, whether that's in the ballot box, or whether that's really even on social media, whether that's even about getting their voices out through their communities, right? So I think it's worth telling the full story of what happened in Ecuador because it was so consequential. We're talking about an election where progressive forces, where Correísmo was set to come back into power, and where the last sweeping kind of coup de grace of the whole campaign was the Colombian government, well, first the Colombian corporate media, which is so deeply tied into the whole infrastructure of Uribismo, claimed to have found a bunch of laptops in the Colombian countryside that belonged to the ELN, one of the last kind of remaining major forces of guerrilla, or formerly left-wing guerrilla fighters, saying that they had funneled thousands and thousands of dollars to the Andrés Arauz campaign, to the Ecuadorian presidential campaign that was tied to Progressive International, through the Progressive International's virtual summit, the whole thing kind of insane. And so it landed in the gossip right-wing press in Colombia, and of course landed with the usual suspects in Colombia, was picked up by the usual suspects in Ecuador, and we thought that it would end there. And then what happens? Ivan Duque sends out his attorney general to have found, I'm putting this in air quotations for your listeners, to have supposedly found those laptops. And not only that, then sends his attorney general to fly in helicopters over to Ecuador and turn in those fake laptops into the government of Ecuador, basically framing Andrés Arauz for having some connection to the ELN, which was then, in an incredible turn of events, debunked by an ornithologist who actually studied those tapes, studied the actual supposed video showing a connection between the ELN and the Andrés Arauz campaign, and observed that the bird sounds that were heard in the background of that video either came from northern Peru or from Colombia itself, basically from Ecuador or northern Peru, debunking the idea that they'd actually come from Colombia, right? So you have this very almost not just absurd, but almost daring, braggadocious interventionary politics, which is so confident in its backing by the United States in particular, that they're willing to go to such tremendous lengths to basically slander and slaughter their left-wing opponents. So you spoke about how narco-terroristic politics are thrown at the left. Most recently, we've seen this in Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who came out in the wake of Petro's victory and called Petro a narco-Marxist or narco-terrorist, right, for Petro's association with his earlier life as a urban guerrilla with the M19, fighting for a constitution for Colombia, which they eventually won in 91, that introduced all these early democratic rights in Colombia, and then dissolved their guerrilla movement and became a legitimate, whatever, popular political movement. That's really where Petro's political career as a parliamentarian, as a congressman, as a mayor of Bogota began, coming out of the M19 movement. So there's a tremendous kind of phenomenon, almost a Karl Rove tactic, in taking what is the real narco politics, the real narco-terroristic politics, which is the paramilitary politics, and turning it on us. Whereas, in fact, it is Plan Colombia, it is these right-wing paramilitaries which have overseen the acceleration of cocaine production, the terrorization of the campesino, indigenous movements across the country, if you want to say, to turn again the kind of narrative on its head, where they claim that the left wing is going to expropriate property. It's the paramilitaries who will be going around the country expropriating property, expropriating territory from indigenous peoples, refusing to engage with their ancestral and territorial claims, and saying, no, this is ours, and not only that, we're going to massively expand the drug trade. And I think that there's something really infuriating and dark and disturbing about the fact that, when we meet with some of these human rights defenders and we say, well, what can we do about this crisis of, call it human rights, call it indigenous sovereignty? They say, well, you know what? The first thing you can do is you can ask your government. You can ask the United States, because even more than Duque, even more than the Colombians, the people who actually know about paramilitary activity, who know about the kind of claiming of land, the expropriation of indigenous territory, the production of cocaine and its export to the United States, the only people who really know the details of those movements is the U.S. Department of State, is our three-letter intelligence agencies. So go back and ask them, because if you really want to shut this down, sure, that starts with accountability here in Colombia, but I'm telling you, the surest and quickest way is to talk to your government, which has basically had a hand in collaborating with, if not facilitating directly, these paramilitary groups who are engaged in their own narco-terroristic activity.
I just wanted to ask, so who is Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez? Like, for people who don't know who they are and why it's so significant, what should they know?
They should know three things. They should know, first of all, who Gustavo Petro is. As you mentioned, he's the president-elect, the former mayor of Bogota, who is known for his kind of steady-handed stewardship of his mayoralty in Bogota, the capital of Colombia, and formerly, much hay is made of his days as a guerrillero when he was a young man, but really he's been a key legislator and a key figure in progressive Colombian politics for a very long time. The second thing they should know is who Francia Marquez is, because it is unbelievably historic that this Afro-Colombian feminist socialist land defender, a winner of the Goldman Prize, for those who care about that kind of credential, but massive inspiration across Colombia, across the continent, across the world, leading the way against extractive industries in defense of these territories, having come from such an impoverished, such an underdeveloped community, is to have her so in the great altitudes of power of Colombian politics is absolutely an historic victory. And it's also critical to know that those two candidates are embedded in a broader coalition known as the Pacto Histórico, the historic pact, which brought together everyone from communists and trots to liberals and even opportunist conservatives, that were brought together into a great big umbrella to fight and defend this politics of change, this politics of life, understanding the urgency of breaking with 20 years of what's known as Uribismo that Nick and I were discussing earlier, that came together to kind of bring this election into fruition. I think it's incredibly rare, certainly those of us who are listening or watching this podcast and those of us who are speaking now understand how rare that kind of strategic unity is in politics, where these disparate forces are not able to put aside their differences, but are able to move very clear-eyed into a kind of coalition that can contest for power. And that's what makes this victory so special. Not that, what it had to break either way. It remains to be seen how that broad coalition will cooperate or disintegrate in the coming weeks and months. However, what I think is critical is that we give credit where credit is due, which is these peasant, indigenous, popular trade union forces who are so deeply repressed, so violently oppressed by the state, who turned out in their masses at unprecedented levels to demand that change and stand with the Pacto Histórico and say, actually, this is our coalition. These are the same forces who would have been prepared today to turn out by the millions to lead a national strike against the possibility of a Rodolfo Hernandez, the right-wing, kind of right populist anti-corruption crusader. And it's really to those people that this victory belongs, right? That came out and decided, we're going to make our voice heard. We're going to agree to this programmatic settlement with these politicians, right? But we're not going to let them just own that victory. We're going to engage in a clear-eyed struggle shoulder to shoulder, but be prepared to enter the government with a really clear-eyed view of what that is. One of our colleagues, I should say, one of our members of the Progressive International, the Congreso dos Pueblos, which itself is an umbrella organization of popular indigenous trade union movements across the country, they have a very nice phrase that I like. They say, it's one thing to take government. It's another thing to take power, and it's a third thing to take popular power. And it's with that really clear-eyed view of what this election means that we come into the next month and a half, where I should warn your listeners and viewers that we don't take power until the 7th of August, right? And during that time, there is still a huge contest for how Uribismo will try to either paralyze, handicap, or steal power from the forces that are preparing to take over the institutions of the state. And it's those forces, grassroots, deeply, deeply grassroots, peripheral forces in the Pacto Histórico who are prepared to say, literally over our dead bodies, are you going to take this victory away from us? So it's that sustained level of popular mobilization that not only made this victory in the presidential race possible, but it's going to make the project of popular power of the Petro presidency possible over the medium.
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that, this kind of monumental task that they have ahead of them, because you have generations, decades of instilled corruption within key institutions in the state, but you also have a kind of popular base that began protesting for the last couple of years very militantly and across the country, very heroically against the police institutions, but also for a variety of social justice, but also economic causes. And how do you think in terms of what you've seen so far in the campaign and the people you've talked to in terms of the electorate, how do you think that they're going to win? I mean, they've won the presidency, they won at the ballot box, but it's another thing to win at at the level of the street level, which they've done to some degree, but nonetheless these institutions are filled with political appointees, with generations of just malfeasance and corruption. Not just internationally from the U.S.'s influence, but also internally and homegrown. How do you feel? Is there a level of optimism that this can change? And if so, what are people imagining that kind of change will look like?
I'm a deeply pessimistic person, but I think it's also clear to kind of transmit the reasons from where that pessimism comes, and why I think it's really helpful to be as clear-eyed as those popular forces in Colombia are about the potential for a Petro presidency. One of those reasons is simply arithmetic. We do not come into this presidency with a majority in Congress. So you're talking about legislating a huge program, and you don't really have the legislative mandate to be able to do that. The other is simply paramilitary. You cannot just wish away huge amounts of arms and territorial conflict. guns are guns. This is a lesson that we're learning very hard in the United States, that you can't just basically win an election and then wish away violence that is so deeply strewn, sort of like methodically strewn into the social fabric of a society. That thing does not just go away. So I think it's really important to be clear-eyed, and that's without even getting into what it's going to be like to unwind or reshape the relationship with the United States that has been so formative for this country over so many decades. So I think it's important to temper expectations about what a Petro presidency will look like. Now, that said, I also think it's important to realize that Petro's agenda from the beginning was not a Bolivarian revolution. It was a very sturdy, thought through, but ultimately social democratic agenda that has three core planks. Two of which are about the kind of politics of life. That's the major thing that united this Francia Marquez Petro ticket. One aspect of the politics of life is about reigniting, restarting a peace process that was basically abandoned by Ivan Duque following the signing of the peace accords in 2016. This was the great hope, as you mentioned, Nick, earlier in the segment, that led to the dissolution of the FARC, or the transformation, I should say, of the FARC from a guerrilla movement in the countryside to a more established, so-called legitimate political party, Comunes. So one of the planks is about actually reclaiming the peace project, the peace process, bringing people to the table. We've already seen, even at this stage, a little bit of fruit of that. I don't want to say it's been totally verified, but a statement came out just today that Petro was retweeting from the ELN, one of the last remaining guerrilla movements that we spoke about in the countryside, saying, okay, we're prepared to come back to the table. That's a huge advance in a peace process, as I mentioned, was basically not just abandoned by Duque, but when we spoke to many of our friends who are deeply involved in the peasant indigenous territorial struggle, they basically said that there's a kind of complicated dialectical relationship between the dissolution of the FARC and the peace process, which is to say, on the one hand, that was a monumental step forward, the 2016 Accords. On the other, the FARC coming out of that armed struggle created these huge vacuums into which right-wing, super violent paramilitaries ended up flooding to serve their own interests and engage in tons of violence against peasants and farmers in the countryside, right? So one of the pieces of Petro's project is basically saying we need to take seriously what peace is, what a politics of life is that takes people's lives seriously. The pandemic of massacres and violence against social leaders, we need to take that seriously. The second piece of the politics of life is about the ecological transition, moving away from fossil fuels over a decent time span, over about 10 years. Fracking gets done away with on day one, but the goal is basically to set Colombia on a trajectory of an ecological transition, moving towards a more sustainable mode of development, according to Petro, that is not just about reducing fossil fuel dependency, but is also about replacing, for example, all those coca crops that are fueling cocaine exports with marijuana crops that can be legalized, that can be produced sustainably, that can be exported and turn Colombia into a more productive economy overall. And then the third piece is a standard slew of social democratic policies, crucially important to Colombia's highly unequal and impoverished population, which is supporting old people with greater pensions and greater state support for vulnerable elders. The second is supporting the family, in particular single mothers, giving more support to mothers in general. And the second is expanding tertiary education and investing hard in free universal university education for young people. So that's an ambitious program, some of which can be maneuvered from the presidency, a lot of which requires legislation in Congress, for which there does not exist a majority for the Pacto Histórico, despite their historic gains in the course of the legislative elections. So there's many challenges, internal, external, political, social, economic, that attend to the country. It would be foolish to go into this second pink tide without being super clear-eyed, for example, about the fact that we're entering a severe global recession, where rate hikes by the U.S. Federal Reserve risk sending Latin America into another lost decade of severe balance of payments crises, of debt unsustainability that leads to IMF bailouts, that lead to austerity, that lead to all the things that we know so well and yet seem so incapable of escaping from. So, I think that both celebrating the project that is now being inaugurated to power and being extremely realistic and clear about what's possible are the only way to square that circle of saying, okay, we have power, but it's one thing to have power, it's another thing to have popular power. And I think that fortunately, unlike in many other cases, in the global north in particular, people in Colombia really do understand that. They really do understand those constraints, and they're willing to engage with them and tinker at their margins. And that's where the street power, where the popular mobilization becomes such a powerful instrument to hold their legislators and ultimately their federal government's feet to the fire to say, these were those promises. We're going to make sure that those are guaranteed. We're going to make progress whether or not you are able to deliver from whatever, your bully pulpit of the presidency or from the positions that you've been able to secure in the Congress.
So we know how powerful the U.S. propaganda machine is, and we know that it's already hard at work in terms of manufacturing news about this historic election. So, what do you anticipate that the U.S. response is going to be further, and how is that going to impact people on the ground in Colombia, and what can we in the U.S. do to combat any misinformation?
So, the crucial thing in making sense of the U.S.-Colombia relationship, it's something I've learned over the course of many years engaging, with these projects and in the broader infrastructure of that Monroe Doctrine that we've mentioned, is that the U.S. state is not one thing. That we have a giant military with a mind of its own that often acts not necessarily in lockstep with the State Department, for example. We saw in Honduras, we're coming to the 28th of June to celebrate, or at least not celebrate, but to commemorate the coup in Honduras. That's something that was facilitated by the U.S. military and only later endorsed by Hillary Clinton and the State Department, right? So whether it's distinguishing between the three-letter intelligence agencies and the military and the NSC and the NSA and the State Department, there is the deep state is in its subterranean magnificent. I mean, it's huge. So that makes it very difficult to predict just how the relationship between the U.S. and Colombia will evolve over the coming years. And there's also the question of, partisan volatility. Ultimately, we do have to reckon with the fact that Donald Trump did not hesitate at all in instigating this coup, this failed coup, Juan Guaido coup in Venezuela, but then that Joe Biden inherited a certain politics about the island of Cuba that led him to basically endorse another coup effort in June of last year, a massive mobilization to take down the revolutionary government there. So the problem with evaluating that is first and foremost the kind of diversity of agencies and institutions that populate the U.S. deep state, that have different motivations, different leadership, different partisan affiliations. And the other problem in evaluating that with high levels of predictive power is that the U.S. relationship to Latin America is evolving a lot. And I think that we can imagine, whether it's allowing remittances finally to come back to Cuba and then taking like an ounce of boot power off the neck of Venezuela by allowing them to lease some of their oil, there is a strategic question that confronts the United States of whether the Monroe Doctrine, by which I interpret that as meaning sort of like, we will, what was the Elon Musk quote, we'll coup whoever we want kind of thing, right? Whether we're going to go with that just like God power over these countries to the southern border, or whether the gamble there is too risky by sending those countries into the arms of our great geopolitical foe, China, and actually, we might want to have a slightly more diplomatic, slightly more friendly approach to those countries to our south, so that we can build a truly hegemonic, in the Gramscian sense, a truly hegemonic force in the hemisphere by which coercion is not our primary instrument of control, but rather kind of comradely friendship and fraternity, right? So I think that those two things, where there's so much different thinking, different strategic thinking, and different partisan and ideological alignment within the United States, I shouldn't say within the United States institutions of the states, and then the ways in which even among those institutions and among the strategic thinkers at their leadership levels, there is some flux in terms of how they make sense of Latin America in the grand strategy of the new Cold War. It makes it very difficult to see how that relationship will evolve. What we do know for sure, and this is a long-winded answer, but what we do know for sure is that 8 days before the first round of this presidential election, the United States, the Biden administration, signed a new agreement for military cooperation with Colombia. Now, you tell me what you think about signing a military agreement 8 days before the administration loses power to the incoming presidency, and then 6 days before the first round of the presidential election, Joe Biden's White House announced major non-NATO ally status to Colombia. That's 6 days before a presidential election. So, I don't think it would be an exaggeration or a stretch to take that as a kind of threat or as a guarantee from the Colombian side of a kind of institutional maintenance vis-a-vis the Colombia-U.S. relationship. So I hate to ask more questions than I answered in response to your question, but I think there are so many constraints and so many moving parts at the same time that evaluating how those constraints hold onto those moving parts makes it very difficult to be quite certain about the evolution of the relationship, especially given that no one thought that this victory was possible in the first place. So we're in a new world. We're in a totally different hemispheric politics than we were even a month ago, and it's going to be very important that we pay very close attention to exactly how all those different institutions of U.S. power are, what they're saying, how they're acting, with whom they're interacting, and from the Colombian side as well, how those other forces of the conservative project are engaging, who's going to D.C., with whom they're talking. That whole ecosystem of power institutional relationships requires deeply careful study, given how difficult it is to kind of hold them down and grab hold of the basic facts of the situation.
There's a pressing question here around the status of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. And I'm glad you brought up Honduras and the coup in Honduras, because Xiomara Castro was recently elected, in a way to reverse that coup, the U.S.-backed coup that you brought up, but also her husband, Manuel Zelaya, got himself in hot water with the United States for his, appeasement and, just talking with Hugo Chavez, and even just developing friendly relations with Venezuela. And I think there's been a little bit of hesitation or suspicion around, what Petro's position on Venezuela is, or in particular, Nicolas Maduro, the elected president, because he's said critical things in the past. But also, Boric has also said critical things of Nicolas Maduro in the past as well. But nonetheless, there is a general sense that he will begin a process, or may begin a process, of normalizing relations with Venezuela, which, maybe some have predicted, like our friend Oli Vargas, who is a Bolivian journalist, may be the final nail in the coffin, of the U.S. war on Venezuela. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, because the two countries are, brothers who've been separated by, particular by this really bloody war that has been fueled by U.S. imperialism and backed by U.S. imperialism and intervention in the region. I believe there are about 5 million Colombians living in Venezuela right now. Many Venezuelans have gone to Colombia because of the sanctions regime that's been in place in Venezuela. And now many are looking to return home because things are stabilizing in Venezuela. The economy, is sort of normalizing. We see Venezuela, even a little bit of a loosening of the screws, so to speak, by opening up or potentially opening up European markets to sell Venezuelan oil. But at the same time, you also see this weird gesturing by the Biden administration by sending somebody like Kamala Harris, which I actually don't know if that's like a stamp of approval or anything if you're sending Kamala Harris to anything, but she was sent to the inauguration of Castro, President Castro in Honduras. So it seems like these things are shifting in really important ways, and almost like in breakneck speed, that it's hard to really kind of pin down where things are going or what things might look like. But I wanted you to speak a little bit about the question of Venezuela in terms of this presidency, and specifically the position of both Marquez and Petro towards Venezuela, and where we can expect things to go, or where we can see potential limits in how Colombia develops or rekindles relations with Venezuela.
Yeah, so Gustavo Petro has promised to restore diplomatic relations with Venezuela, which, as you mentioned, is a huge controversial position in Colombia because Venezuela has been the defining bright red line for Uribismo for 2 decades now. Just absolutely the hard line on the Bolivarian Revolution. You cannot speak well of Chavez, and certainly not of his successor Maduro, without severe political backlash. And I think that explains a lot of Petro rather, kind of playing the politics and creating the distance as he saw necessary between himself and the Venezuelan government to say, I'm not them. I have a different project. I'm not engaged in the Bolivarian revolutionary project, despite having these kind of historical ties to Chavez and being, friendly politically and obviously, thinking of himself in similar ideological terms at the broadest and highest level. I think that to make sense of that relationship in the medium term, and again, I here hesitate to make definitive predictions. I wouldn't go as far as Ali would in terms of nails in coffins, because I think that the critical thing to make sense of the U.S. role in the hemispheric politics over the past several decades is a really critical shift from overt modes of intervention to more covert modes of intervention. So where earlier politics of maintaining the Monroe Doctrine involved coups, military intervention, much more explicit and less apologetic modes of intervention, in that great almost Clintonian shift towards human rights, and that being a really prized reputational factor for the U.S., we saw a shift from those more overt modes to more covert modes. In particular, we saw economic sanctions become the primary tool by which we disciplined other countries, adversarial countries, and maintain a kind of control over the hemisphere. And that was a very clever move, because what allowed the U.S. to do is basically externalize the costs of their intervention. So if overt modes were more chaotic and destructive in the short term, over the medium term, those overt modes actually had the effect of uniting their victims in a kind of Bolivarian anti-imperialism, to say, okay, look, we've all suffered at the hand of active U.S. intervention. The Yankee is just stomping on our country, and so we need to bring us together. But what the sanction regime has done is externalize the costs, is basically diffuse that Bolivarian anti-imperialist effect to say, oh, it's not our fault that your economy is suffering, it's your fault. That the sanction, if you can't figure out how to live with these sanctions, that's your fault, right? So the Venezuelan economy is tanking. That's not the United States' fault. That's just because you're governed so terribly, right? And so that the fact of the sort of so-called macroeconomic mismanagement of the Venezuelan economy then becomes Venezuela's fault, or the Chavez's fault, right? And as a result of that, they become this kind of not only economically untouchable due to the structure of the sanctions, but politically untouchable because you don't want to be part of one of those disastrous economic projects, right? The ghost of Venezuela's so-called macroeconomic mismanagement then haunts left politics across the region. And the net effect is that it creates this deep dividing line between the so-called good left, the unsanctioned social democratic good left, and the bad left, which inevitably is the sanctioned bad left, whose economic woes, are deeply built into the strategy of U.S. foreign policy to foment a kind of despair that would then lead to some kind of insurrectionary or anti-revolutionary or counter-revolutionary sentiment. So I bring up that shift from overt to covert modes of intervention because the reason why this pink tide is so important, no matter how much we may disagree with the particular ideological orientation of its leaders, of its presidents, prime ministers across the region, is because the more countries that turn pink, the more countries that participate in this, the greater that collective, the ability for collective action is, right? The less important the dividing line is between good left and bad left. There's only 4 left-wing governments. It's kind of like, okay, how are we going to distinguish ourselves, and how are we not going to become such a victim on our own to that covert mode of intervention, which could isolate us completely in the global economy? But the more countries that turn to the left, the more those countries are able to come together, build an economic bloc, defend each other, provide each other with cheap oil or cheap agriculture or cheap doctors and medical care, as Cuba's been doing for so many decades, right? And so, I think that there's the reason why the momentum is so important for this whole project, no matter if you disagree with any one of these national leaders, is because the sum is so much greater than its parts when it comes to the broader project of popular sovereignty in Latin America, that we kind of have to defend all of them. We have to defend all of them because the important thing is even raising the bar a little bit in terms of their ability to build regional institutions of integration that defend against the whims of U.S. empire, that defends against the desire to intervene in the region and the desire to externalize those interventions and blame those countries for their mismanagement, even though it's the U.S. instruments of hybrid warfare that are doing the dirty work, right? And so I think that's why the Colombian election at the end of the day is so crucial and so definitive, because it gives even more momentum to a broader shift away from these right collaborationist projects towards left and progressive projects that give a new life to that project of popular sovereignty everywhere.
So you were talking earlier about the so-called pink tide or red tide, as it's referred to sometimes also. And so, we have, as you mentioned, the 4 explicitly socialist governments: Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, and Nicaragua. But now we have social democratic wins and elections happening, but they're not necessarily winning a democratic majority of state power. So one, like, how do you think plurinationalism plays into all of this? And what do we have to learn from all these combined movements?
Huge questions. Let's start with plurinationalism. I think that when it comes to let's start with, Chile is a really important place to look at the relationship between the pink tide. I think it's appropriate to call it a pink tide when it comes to the victory of Gabriel Boric and the Broad Front in Chile and plurinationalism, which is to say it's just not enough to win a presidential election. Right? So what makes that victory historic is, of course, that a young and left-leaning and new progressive force has come to power. But what really made it so historic is that a government won that was promising to protect the integrity of a constitutional convention process that was going to legislate, not just bury Pinochet's 1980 constitution, famous for enshrining principles of neoliberal and anti-majoritarian governance, but because plurinationalism, as well as feminism and workers' rights and health and housing and all these various rights, could become the guiding vision and the guiding legal architecture of that country. Right? So it shows us the relationship between the pink and the red, between, I guess it's important to, now that I'm on the red nation here, really I think that that's a good point between the pink and the red, right? There's a way in which we have to see it as positive sum when we're able to move the politics in a direction that's more amenable to the kind of deep democratic transformations towards plurinational recognition of territorial rights and indigenous sovereignty and indigenous power that are just the first things to slip from view, if not to be eviscerated by iron fist when the right comes to power. And so I'm excited about this project. I want to put myself on the sidelines here because I think that you and Nick and all of us have an obligation to reach out to our friends and partners, certainly looking at Ecuador, a country where we lost a presidential election, and we still see the sustained popular mobilization that is capturing the country right now, led by the CONAIE and the indigenous forces of Ecuador, to say it is our responsibility to take advantage of this moment in history to lead a plurinational revolution across the Americas, all the way from the top of Canada down to the tip of Argentina, to say, that is a project that unites these forces, and we should celebrate that even those progressive forces of the pinkest shade claim to be committed to that project, and really take advantage of the opportunity that we have, which we do not know when it will come again, to lead a deeper transformation and to demand it from the streets to the presidential palace, from Colombia and Chile all the way up to the United States and Canada.
Okay, so last question. Do you think Lula will win in Brazil?
Not only do I think Lula will win in Brazil, I think that Lula is such a critical piece of this puzzle that we can't let him lose. Lula, in part because of the absolutely giant economic and heft of Brazil, 220 million people, absolutely massive country. We sometimes forget it. Has the ability to move the geopolitics in that great non-aligned movement that we so desperately need, to build a bloc around popular and South-South sovereignty that only with that government in power we can stand behind. And Lula historically has been a friend to the Bolivarian revolutions as well as to the pinker shade progressive governments. And he's I think, not only, I don't want to say him as a person, but Brazil as a country is absolutely indispensable in that project of regional integration, of Monroe Doctrine confrontation, and of global geopolitical transformation that we so desperately need. And I think that now more than ever, the Lula government is amenable to precisely that plurinational shift that we discussed. Certainly, Nick and I were in Brazil not so long ago, teaming up with the largest mobilization of indigenous peoples in the history of the country. You can see how activated those popular indigenous forces are, which, like in Colombia, are prepared to hit the streets and demand the changes that are offered rhetorically by word by their politicians entering power. And I think that it's our responsibility to not just guarantee Lula's victory in the presidential elections, but like our friends in Colombia who distinguish between government power and popular power, to demand that third piece all over the Americas. And I think it's just an exciting moment, but one that calls us all to action, given the responsibility that it demands of us to take advantage of that moment before it's lost.